The desert at night doesn't feel empty out on US 95. It feels like it's waiting. Wind shoved sand across the asphalt in pale streaks that flashed in my headlights, then vanished. The windshield was peppered with grit. It hissed under the wipers, even though I wasn't using them. Every few miles the road dipped and rose, and my beams swept the dark like I was scanning an ocean with no shoreline. My left hand stayed locked on the wheel. My right kept drifting to my phone because it wouldn't stop buzzing in the cup holder. I didn't even have to look to know what it was. Overdue, low balance, another warning that wasn't a warning at all. Payment will be returned. That line had been sitting in my stomach since afternoon. I wasn't mad in a way that helped. I was just tired of numbers that never stopped coming. Tired of pretending a tight week was temporary when it'd been months of tight weeks stacked together. I tried to drive like everything was normal. I set the cruise. I clicked the AC on, then off, then on again, like I could bargain with the gas gauge if I acted casual. The fuel needle sat too close to empty for comfort. I checked it, checked the clock, checked the distance to the next town, then did the math again because I didn't trust myself. My shoulders were up around my ears and I kept forcing them down. The buzz hit again, longer this time, so I picked the phone up and saw the recruiter's name. He'd been dangling overnight coverage gigs for weeks like they were favors. I stared at the message, then looked back at the black ribbon of highway ahead and felt the simple urge to turn around and go home. Home wasn't safe either. Home was bills and late fees and a car note that didn't care if I was tired. I pulled into a tiny roadside gas station instead, one of those places with harsh fluorescent lights and a store that smelled like burnt coffee and floor cleaner. The clerk didn't make conversation. I bought the cheapest thing I could justify, paid, and walked back out into air that smelled like dust and fuel. In the lot, under that buzzing light, I reread the offer until the words stopped sliding around. One more missed car payment and they'd take it. If they took the car, I'd lose the next job, and then I'd lose the one after that. It wasn't dramatic. It was just how it worked. The car wasn't a luxury, it was my legs. And there was a medical bill sitting in my email that I kept not opening because I already knew what it said. "What's the pay?" I asked. "I need you here tonight. No delays," the recruiter insisted. I stared at the screen after that, thumb hovering. Then I typed back yes before I could talk myself out of it. Back on the highway, the desert closed in again, and after a while I saw it, a lonely cluster of industrial yellow lights far ahead, sitting in the dark like an island. I told myself I just had to stay clean for a few weeks, stack cash, and get out. Then I drove toward it anyway. The turnoff didn't look like an entrance to anything important. It was just a break in the shoulder and a narrow service road dropping away from the highway into the dark. My headlights caught reflective tape stapled to posts, little silver flashes that winked back and disappeared as I rolled past. Cones were set in a sloppy line like someone had meant to fix them and never did. A chain-link fence rose out of nowhere, topped with a second strip of wire. Two cameras sat on poles and moved in slow, lazy arcs, like they had all night to watch me arrive. There wasn't a sign that said, "Welcome." There wasn't even a sign that said, "You're in the right place." Just a stenciled site code on a metal panel and an internal phone number underneath it. The number looked less like help and more like something you called right before you got escorted off the property. I stopped at a gate arm. The guard booth was a squat box of glass and metal with a single light inside. A man stepped out, heavy jacket, flashlight in hand, and shined it straight at my windshield. It wasn't aggressive, just routine, the way you'd check a label on a box. He waited until I rolled the window down, took my ID, and looked at it a beat too long. Not suspicious exactly. More like he was making sure my name matched what he expected to see tonight. "Phone in the locker. Keys stay on you," the guard barked. I nodded like that was fine, like my phone wasn't the only thing that made me feel like I still had a line back to the world. He handed me a temporary badge and pointed me toward a row of lockers along the wall inside the checkpoint building. The air smelled like old coffee and printer toner. I opened a locker, dropped my phone in, closed it, and felt the quiet hit me right away. No vibration, no glow, no easy way to check the time unless I stared at my watch like a nervous habit. He scanned the badge, watched the little light blink, and waved me through another door. On the other side was a small surface room that looked like it had been designed by someone who hated comfort. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A ventilation fan hummed in the corner, steady and dry. A SCADA display was mounted on the wall with colored lines and blocks that meant nothing to me yet, but still gave the place a heartbeat. There were printed checklists stacked in a tray, corners curled. A clipboard sat on a counter like it lived there, like it had never been outside in daylight. I signed in on a sheet that already had a few names on it, all in the same tight handwriting. Then I waited, listening to the building. Not the desert outside, the building itself. Pipes carried sound differently. The room had its own rhythm, a faint vibration under my boots, like a distant motor that didn't change speed. A door opened behind me and a woman walked in like she belonged to the building. Mid-40s, hair pulled back, jacket zipped, eyes that didn't waste time. No smile, no small talk. She looked at my badge, looked at my face, and spoke like she was checking an item off a list. "You're Caleb Rains," Marla said flatly. "Yes," I told her, and it came out too fast. She didn't react to my tone. She just moved to the counter, pulled a folder from a file box, and flipped it open. Everything she did was clean and economical. No extra motion, no hesitation that suggested she was thinking about my comfort. "This place runs on routine. You stay in it. You'll be fine," she told me. She said it like a fact, not encouragement, like the routine was the real supervisor here, and she was just the person standing closest to the door. She pointed at the SCADA screen, then at the stack of checklists. She gave me the basic shape of the shift in plain language, not a speech. What to monitor, what to record, what not to touch yet. I asked a couple of questions the way you do when you're trying to sound competent, but she answered in the same short operational tone, like she was reading from a mental script. Then she nodded toward a heavy metal door at the back of the room. "Come on," she said, already moving. The door was thick, painted gray, with a handle that looked like it had been replaced a few times. It opened with a weighty pull, and the air that came through was cooler, damp, and laced with machine oil. Beyond it was a landing and a set of steel stairs going down. The sound of the pump got louder as we descended, not a roar, more like a low, steady note, almost soothing at first, the kind of sound that makes you feel like the system is stable. Then I noticed it didn't vary, not even a little. No surge, no flutter, no normal mechanical drift. It held the same pitch and the same pressure against my ears like a metronome keeping time for a song I couldn't hear. We hit the lower level and stepped into a corridor lined with pipe runs and cable trays. The walls were concrete, stained in places with labels that had been painted over and repainted. The floor changed under my feet. Dry concrete gave way to sections of metal grating where water had slicked the edges. The lights down here were bright but harsh, the kind that flatten everything. Marla walked at an even pace and pointed things out without slowing. She showed me gauge clusters mounted at regular intervals. She showed me sight glasses on the lines, small round windows that let you see the flow. She showed me a blue emergency phone set into a wall alcove, its paint chipped, the plastic yellowed like it had been there forever. Then She stopped at something that made no sense in a place that loved order. A bright yellow line painted straight across the floor, from wall to wall, right in the middle of a corridor. No sign explaining it, no arrow, just a line. Near it, on the wall beside a wet grating section, a thick metal bar was mounted, bare and scuffed, like a handrail that had never been painted. I recognized it for what it was without her saying it. A grounding bar. Something you touched when you didn't want your body to be the path. Marla looked at me, not asking if I understood, just checking whether I was paying attention. She pulled a pen from her pocket and marked a route on the printed loop sheet, a simple path that ran from one cluster to the next in a clean circuit. It was the same word again and again, even when she didn't say it out loud. Routine. 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 I tried to keep my tone light, tried to make it sound like I'd done this kind of thing 100 times. "What am I watching for down there?" I asked. Marla didn't roll her eyes. She didn't smile. She just answered like she was giving the only honest reply. "Your steps," she said quietly. And that was the first time her voice softened at all. Not warm, just quieter, like she didn't want the walls to hear. She handed me the loop sheet, pointed out where I'd start, where I'd end, and how to log the times. No ghost stories, no warnings about monsters, just calm safety talk delivered with a flat certainty that made my skin prickle anyway. It felt like being trained for a job that had a hazard no one wanted to name. When we climbed back up to the surface room, the fluorescent buzz seemed louder than before. Marla set a fresh checklist on the counter and slid it toward me. "Start your first loop," she told me, voice back to normal. "Keep your log clean." I picked up the paper and nodded. The place read like an industrial job that was a little old and a little unpleasant, the kind of facility where people survived on habit, because habit was easier than thinking about what could go wrong. I could tolerate weird site quirks. I could tolerate a supervisor who didn't do friendly. I just needed the money, and I just needed to get through the night. Marla didn't hand me the rules like a warning. She handed them to me like paperwork, like something that had been sitting in a folder for years and only mattered because someone decided it did. Plain white paper, no logo, no dramatic heading, no bold red letters trying to scare me straight. 5 numbered lines, short enough to fit on half a page. The font looked like it had been copied, then copied again, until the edges of the letters went soft. The kind of sheet that didn't belong to one person. It belonged to the building. "Read it! Don't skim it!" Marla snapped. I took it with both hands without meaning to. The fluorescent light above us made the page look even more sterile, like a hospital form. I read the first line, then the second. The words were simple, but the instructions weren't. They weren't like the safety posters you see in every plant. They weren't the kind of rules you could explain with common sense in one sentence. My first reaction was the same one I always had when someone gave me a procedure that felt wrong. I wanted the reason. I wanted the failure mode. I wanted the story that made the line make sense. That wasn't curiosity. It was how I stayed safe. If you know why something is dangerous, you don't cut corners by accident. "This doesn't look like a normal SOP, I said. Marla didn't look offended. She looked relieved that I'd said it out loud, like now we could stop pretending. "It works. That's all you need to know," she insisted. Her voice had the same tone as a supervisor telling you not to argue with a lockout tag. Not because she wanted power, but because she didn't have time for you to learn the hard way. I glanced down again and forced myself to read slowly, like she told me. I let the words land, one by one, without rewriting them into something more comfortable. Rule 1 had a number in it that felt too specific to be random. Rule 2 told me to do something that went against my instincts. Rule 3 sounded like a maintenance trick, except it was written like a boundary. Rule 4 sounded gross and stupid until you remembered electricity doesn't care how you feel. Rule 5 was the one that made my neck tighten because it asked me not to do the most basic thing technicians do when a system flashes a warning. Don't correct it, don't reconcile it, don't make it clean, just log it. I looked up from the page and met her eyes. I was waiting for her to crack, to admit this was some kind of old site superstition, a hazing ritual for new night shift hires. She didn't crack. She stood there like the rules were as normal as a torque spec. She tapped the paper with a knuckle. "Down there, you log first. You don't improvise," she told me. That sentence was the real rule, I realized. The numbered lines were the shape of it. The core was simple, even if the details weren't. Down below, the building didn't want me making choices. It wanted me following a sequence. It wanted me recording, not correcting. Marla held out a pen and a small acknowledgement form. Just a date line, a signature line, a checkbox that said I had received and understood the addendum. I signed it because arguing would change nothing, and because I was already here. The pen scratched slightly, like the paper was cheap and thin. She tucked the form back into her folder with the same care she used on everything else. Then she pointed at the rules sheet again, not letting me fold it yet. "Say Rule 1 back to me," she muttered. I looked down, read it again, slower. "If any pressure gauge needle sticks exactly on 66 for more than 6 seconds, step behind the yellow line and don't look back until it drops." It felt ridiculous just sitting there on the page, like a riddle someone wrote at 3 in the morning. But the way she watched me made it feel less like a riddle and more like a test, not of belief, of compliance. I repeated it back in my head first, then in my own voice, careful to get the steps right, not because I suddenly believed in anything, because if I was going to do this job, I was going to do it clean. Marla nodded once, barely. She didn't explain where the yellow line came from. She didn't tell me what happened if you looked back. She didn't say the words haunted or cursed or anything that would have made it easy to dismiss. She just let the silence hang until the urge to ask more died on its own. When she finally waved me off, I folded the rules page into a neat rectangle and slid it into my chest pocket. The paper warmed against my shirt like it wanted to be kept close. I told myself it was just a weird old facility with traditions and habits, the kind of place where people collected rules the way they collected keys. I told myself I could follow 5 lines on a page, do my loop, log my numbers, and go home. I still felt in control when I picked up my clipboard. That mattered. At the start of the night, control is something you can pretend you own. Later, you find out who's really holding it. I wrote the start time at the top of the paper log and underlined it once, not for drama, just so my eyes would land there when I flipped back later. The station clock in the surface room said 22:12. My watch said 22:11. I trusted my watch more, but I logged what the station clock showed because that was the one everyone here would argue from if anything went sideways. I checked my pen, clicked it twice, watched the ink dot the page clean and dark. Flashlight, bright and steady. Gloves, no tears. I adjusted the clipboard clip until it held the pages tight enough that they wouldn't flap when I walked. The rules sheet sat warm against my chest, folded flat, a quiet weight under the fabric. I told myself I wouldn't need it. Marla had said it enough times that the lines were already stuck in my head, like a checklist you can hear even when you're not looking at it. Routine. Loop. Log it clean. I went back through the heavy door and started down the steel stairs. Each step rang through the frame, a clean metallic sound that didn't get absorbed by carpet or drywall the way normal buildings do. The air changed as soon as the door shut behind me. Up top, everything was dry and bright in that office way, buzzing light and paper and plastic. Down here it was damp, cool, metallic. The smell of machine oil sat in the back of my throat. The pump tone pressed against my ears like a steady note held by an instrument that never needed to breathe. It didn't rise and fall. It didn't wander. It just stayed, the same pitch, the same pressure, as if the building had chosen one sound and decided it was going to keep it all night. At the bottom landing, I paused long enough to look at the route sheet again. Marla's marks were blunt and simple, like she'd drawn the path for someone who didn't have time to get lost. Start here, end here, read here, log here. I turned into the corridor and started where she'd told me to start, at the first panel cluster. The cabinet door was labeled in faded block letters. I didn't bother reading the label out loud. I opened it, checked the status lights, checked the motor indicator, checked the little analog meter that showed load. Green, green, steady, nothing flashing, no alarm tone. I listened again, not with my ears so much as my whole body. The baseline pump tone felt stable, even if it felt too stable, like the sound was being held in place. I closed the cabinet, stepped to the first gauge cluster, and read the needles like I'd done 100 times in 100 places. Pressure, steady, temperature, within range. I wrote the numbers, wrote the exact time, and moved on. I didn't round. I didn't close enough it. If I was going to get paid to be here, I was going to be the guy who could point at a line on paper later and say, "This is what it was. This is when I saw it." Between stations, the corridor was concrete and pipe runs, with cable trays overhead and junction boxes along the wall. My boots sounded different on the dry concrete than they did on the metal grating. Concrete was dull. Grating rang a little, like you were walking on the lid of something hollow. The lighting was bright but harsh, the kind that flattened everything and made shadows look like stains. I noted where damp patches collected and where the air felt colder. I noted where the floor changed texture underfoot, where my heel slipped a fraction, where the metal grating flexed like it was suspended over empty space. Water makes everything honest. It shows you where people actually walk, where they slip, where they drag equipment. The next gauge cluster sat just past a blue emergency phone alcove. The phone looked older than everything around it. Yellowed plastic, cord in a lazy loop, receiver sitting in its cradle like it expected to be used and hated the idea of it. It didn't ring. It didn't light. It just sat there, silent and patient. Seeing it still tightened something in my stomach, the way a fire extinguisher can, the way an eye wash station can. Those things are neutral until the moment they aren't, and you don't get to pick the moment. I checked the gauges, logged them, and moved to the drains. Floor drains are supposed to be boring. You look for backups, discoloration, smells that don't belong. I crouched, shined my light, watched the flow. Steady trickle, no foam, no oily sheen. A little grit collected around the rim, nothing unusual. The smell was damp concrete and machine oil, with a faint edge of bleach from whatever they used upstairs. Nothing that screamed trouble. I wrote clear in the margin and moved on. At the next junction, a wall-mounted SCADA screen sat in a steel frame, bolted like it was part of the wall. I kept my hands off it. I glanced long enough to confirm the readings matched what I'd just written. They did. The numbers lined up, neat and indifferent. No warnings, no flashing blocks. I felt a small, stupid relief anyway, like I'd just been waved through a checkpoint. I didn't let myself stare. Staring turns a quick confirmation into a habit, and habits are how you end up touching buttons you don't need to touch. I didn't let myself stare, and I kept walking. At 2217, I logged the second cluster and wrote the location code the same way Marla had on her route sheet. The system, still felt like a system. Panel, gauge, drain, screen, move. I could feel my shoulders starting to drop. I could feel my breathing evening out. In the distance, somewhere deeper in the corridors, I heard a soft clunk like a tool set down on concrete, then a faint scrape, then nothing. The sound wasn't close enough to be a problem. It was just proof that I wasn't the only person down here. At 22:26, I logged the third cluster. The pressure needle crept up slowly, paused just shy of a number that made my eyes catch, then drifted back down. It hovered near 66 without landing there, like a hand hovering over a stove burner to see if it's hot. The motion was smooth in a way that didn't feel like vibration. It didn't jitter. It didn't twitch. It moved like it had intention. Then it gave up and settled back into range. I stared at it for one extra breath, then wrote the reading as is and added a short note. Needle drift. Returned. I started to settle into the rhythm, step, read, write, move. The loop stopped being a maze and started being a pattern. That's what routine does. It turns a place you don't trust into a place you think you understand. I kept my handwriting neat because messy writing is how you turn a log into an argument. I used the same abbreviations each time. I kept the times exact. If I was going to be anxious, I was going to be anxious in a useful way. Halfway through the route, I heard footsteps before I saw anyone. Not close, not rushing, just steady tread on concrete. A flashlight beam slid across the wall ahead, then dipped down. I rounded a corner and found a guy leaning near a panel cabinet with his own clipboard, one hand in his jacket pocket like he was keeping it warm. "You the new guy?" Drew asked. "Yeah, first night," I said. "Relax, it's boring down here," he muttered. "Marla says stick to routine," I told him. "Marla says a lot of things," he said with a dry laugh. He had that look of someone who'd been doing the same job long enough to stop respecting it. Not sloppy, not reckless, just comfortable. The kind of guy who knew which noises mattered and which ones didn't, and who treated most rules like paperwork meant to cover someone else. His badge hung from a lanyard, like it didn't mean much. His boots were scuffed in the way of someone who walked these corridors like a commute. I didn't ask him how long he'd been here. I didn't want to know. I nodded and kept moving, because standing still down here made me feel exposed. Drew went back to whatever he was doing without following me, and that made the place feel staffed, real, grounded. That was the point of having another person down here, even if he didn't mean to be comforting. The next corridor ran along a thicker bank of pipe, larger diameter, paint chipped at the edges where metal showed through. A sight glass sat on one run, a round window bolted in place. It looked harmless in the harsh light. Just water, just movement, just a tool. I told myself that as I walked past because my eyes kept wanting to flick toward it anyway. The glass caught my flashlight beam and threw back a quick reflection, my own face broken into a pale oval. I didn't like seeing myself down here. It made it feel less like a job and more like a place that noticed you. The pump tone shifted slightly around 22:33. Not dramatic. The note deepened for maybe a second, then returned. My shoulders tightened anyway. I stopped, put my hand on the panel cabinet for balance, and listened. The vibration through the metal felt heavier for a moment, like pressure building behind a door, then it smoothed out again. I checked the indicator lights, all green, all steady. I logged the time and added a short note, minor tone dip. I tried to convince myself I was being thorough, not jumpy. At 22:41, I logged another gauge cluster, pressure higher than the last reading, then settling, within range, temperature stable. I wrote it down, kept the time exact, kept the line clean. My pen made a dry scratch sound that was louder than it should have been, because down here there wasn't much soft noise. Every little sound had edges. I passed another blue phone alcove, still silent. The receiver sat perfectly straight in its cradle, as if someone had set it down with care. The cord didn't sway. Nothing moved. I kept my eyes on the route sheet and the gauges because looking at the phone made me feel like I was waiting for it to do something, and I didn't want to stand around waiting. The yellow line showed up again, painted across the corridor in that too bright color. Still unexplained, still in the wrong place. It cut across the floor like a boundary someone drew without asking permission. I slowed without meaning to, then stepped over it and kept walking. Nothing happened. That should have made me feel better. Instead, it made me feel like the line was waiting for the right moment, like it wasn't a warning, it was a measurement. The wet grating section came next. Water pooled shallow over the metal, spreading in a thin sheet that reflected the lights. The grating flexed just enough under my weight to remind me it was a surface on top of something, not a floor in the normal sense. A grounding bar was mounted on the wall beside it, bare metal scuffed smooth where hands had touched it. I noticed it and moved on, telling myself I'd deal with it if I had to. My gloves squeaked as I adjusted the clipboard under my arm, and I hated that sound, because it made the corridor feel smaller than it was. At 22:58, I logged the last major station in Marla's route. The numbers still matched what the wall screen said. Nothing was flashing. The pump tone was still steady. My log was full of clean lines and exact times, and the steadiness of it started to feel like proof. Proof that the rules page in my chest pocket was just a relic. Proof that routine could tame anything if you stuck to it long enough. I told myself I could do another loop like this and it would be the same. Just more numbers, more paper, more time passing. I headed into the final corridor that would bring me back toward the stairwell. And that's when I heard it. A single ping, sharp and metallic, like someone had tapped the pipe with a wrench 2 halls away. It wasn't loud. It didn't echo like a dropped tool. It traveled. I could feel it more than to hear it, a tiny vibration sliding through the metal, moving along the pipe run as if the sound itself had direction. I stopped, just for a beat. My pen hovered over the log. My light stayed pointed at the floor. I listened for footsteps, for another ping, for anything that would explain it. There was nothing, no voice, no movement, just the steady pump tone, unchanged, and the sound of my own breathing inside my jacket. I wrote metal ping with the time beside it, then forced my boots to move again. Routine, loop, log it clean. I kept walking toward the stairs, telling myself it was just a pipe settling, just temperature change, just the building being a building. And I held on to that explanation because it was the only one that let me keep going. I hit the yellow line again on my next pass, and the gauge cluster beside it was the same one I'd watched drift near 66 earlier. I walked up with my clipboard tucked tight under my arm, flashlight angled low so I could read clean without throwing glare onto the glass. The needle eased upward like it was following a smooth ramp. No jitter, no vibration. It moved with a calm patience that made my skin tighten before it even got there. It reached 66 and stopped dead, perfectly centered on the mark, like someone had pinned it in place. I stared at it for half a second, then forced myself not to stare, because staring turns into thinking, and thinking turns into improvising. I checked my watch and started counting in my head. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, the way you do when you're trying to make sure you're not cheating yourself. At 6, the needle still hadn't moved. It wasn't stuck like a broken gauge. It wasn't shaking like it wanted to break loose. It was simply still, unnaturally still, like the entire system had decided that number mattered more than the rest. My chest pocket felt heavier, like the folded page knew I was looking at the line it had warned me about. I didn't pull it out. I didn't need to. I knew exactly what it said. I stepped back behind the yellow line the way you'd step back from an exposed bus bar, like the paint itself had teeth. My boots crossed the boundary and I stopped with my toes just clear of it. I tipped my head down so my eyes landed on the grating instead of the gauge. It took effort not to look over my shoulder. That's what bothered me most. The rule wasn't asking me to do something hard. It was asking me to fight a reflex. The pump tone kept running, steady and indifferent, but the air felt different on my skin. Not colder, not warmer, just denser, like the space had been vacuum sealed. My breath sounded loud in my own ears. The light above me seemed harsher, like it had more edge to it. I held still and waited, because waiting was what the rule demanded. I could feel the urge to glance back, just to confirm, just to see if the needle had dropped, just to reassure myself that the rule worked. The urge felt childish, like touching a bruise. I kept my eyes on the grating and counted again, not out loud, just numbers in my head. Then the pressure in the air eased. It wasn't dramatic. It was subtle, like your ears clearing after driving down a mountain. The pump tone didn't change, but my body registered the shift anyway. I waited one more beat before I let myself turn, and when I looked, the needle had dropped back into range like nothing had happened. No trace of it sticking. No reason, on paper, for anyone to believe me if I described it. I wrote it down anyway. Exact time. Location code. Needle pinned at 66 for over 6 seconds, followed rule, returned to normal. I kept the line clean and readable, because if I made it messy, I'd give myself an excuse to doubt it later. I moved on, but I didn't feel the same as I had 10 minutes earlier. Before, the rules had felt like quirks. Now they felt like boundaries, the kind you don't understand until you step too close and something snaps at you. The worst part was how clean it had been. No chaos, no alarm. Just a calm, precise event that made the rule feel like it belonged here, like it was written to match a real behavior the way you write a safety procedure to match a real hazard. A few corridors later, I found Drew again, leaning near the discharge run where the sight glass was mounted. He was checking something on a panel, shoulders loose, posture relaxed. Seeing him should have made me feel better. Instead, it made me aware of how alone I'd been at the yellow line, how quiet it had been when the gauge decided to stop. The pump tone shifted right as I came up, deepening for a second, then holding at that deeper note longer than it had earlier. My stomach tightened. It wasn't loud. It wasn't screaming. It was wrong in a way my body recognized before my brain could label it. My eyes wanted to flick to the sight glass automatically, to confirm flow, to look for bubbles, to look for cavitation. That's the technician reflex. You don't like mysteries in moving systems. You hear that tone change? I asked. Yeah, happens, Drew said casually. He didn't even look worried. He didn't even pause what he was doing. That casualness was its own kind of pressure, like he was daring me to stop being careful. Don't look at the glass, I warned. It's just water, man, he scoffed. He glanced toward the sight glass anyway, quick and confident, like he was proving a point. For a split second he grinned, like he'd won. Then his eyes hitched. Just a fraction. A tiny stall, like a skipping frame in a video. The grin didn't fade, but it stopped being real. He blinked once, hard, and the casualness snapped back into place like a mask being pulled tight. He laughed too late, like he'd remembered to. I didn't ask what he saw. I didn't ask if he saw anything. I didn't want him to say it out loud. I didn't want words for it. Words make things stick. The tone held, low and heavy, vibrating through the metal under my boots. I kept my eyes on the floor, grading the way the rule told me to, and I walked past the sight glass without looking into it. It felt like walking past an open door in a dark house. You don't turn your head, you don't slow down, you keep your route. On the other side of that run, the blue emergency phone sat in its alcove, silent and patient like it had been all night. I tried not to think about it. I tried to treat it like equipment. I'd dealt with emergency phones before. You test them, you reset them, you log that they function. You don't project meaning onto them, but it rang once, not a full ring cycle like a normal call. One sharp burst, then silence, like a finger tapping a bell and pulling away. The hair on my arms lifted under my sleeves. I stood there for a heartbeat, hand hovering, the part of my brain that loved solving problems, trying to take control. Answer it. Confirm the line. Clear the alarm. But it wasn't a call. It didn't feel like a call. It felt like a signal aimed at me. I didn't pick up the receiver. I held the reset button in, counted 3 seconds exactly, then released. The button clicked softly under my thumb. The phone stayed silent. Nothing lit up, nothing chirped to confirm. It just sat there like it had never made a sound. I wrote it down in the margin. 1 ring. Reset held 3 seconds. No further activity. I moved on, because routine was the only thing that still felt like mine. The wall-mounted SCADA screen was 2 turns later. The frame was bolted tight, the screen washed in that familiar palette of lines and blocks, normal enough that for a moment my brain tried to relax. I stepped close, just long enough to match the numbers to my log like I'd been doing. That was all. Confirmation, not adjustment. Then the display flashed a new banner, clean and bright against the grid. Reconcile. Under it, a flow rate value I hadn't entered. Not wildly wrong, not catastrophic. The kind of error that makes a report look sloppy. The kind of error that triggers questions from people who've never walked below grade in their lives. I felt the urge to fix it so hard, it was almost physical, like my hand wanted to reach through the air and press the correction without my permission. I kept my hands at my sides. I read it twice to make sure I wasn't misreading. I checked the time. I looked at the location code printed on the frame. I wrote it all down on paper, exact, with the same neat handwriting I'd been forcing all night. The screen stayed on reconcile for 3 seconds, maybe 4, then cleared itself like nothing had happened. The numbers returned to normal. No alert history. No flashing indicator to prove it had been there. If I hadn't been looking at the exact moment, I could have missed it. If I'd tried to correct it, I would have been touching the system instead of logging it, and I didn't know what that would buy me down here. I stepped back from the screen and realized my jaw was tight. My shoulders were up again. My breathing had gone shallow. I hated that because I knew what it meant. The place had gotten what it wanted. Not a mistake, not a broken rule. Just my attention, my focus, my energy. I thought about the yellow line, the pinned needle, the way the air had felt compressed like the corridor itself had leaned in closer. I thought about Drew's eyes hitching for a fraction of a second after he looked into the sight glass. I thought about the phone ringing once like a tap on the shoulder. I looked down at my log, at the clean lines of ink and the exact times, and the steadiness of it suddenly felt less like control and more like a railing you cling to when the floor starts to tilt. I didn't want to admit that to myself. I wanted the job to be boring. I wanted routine to be a comfort, not a survival strategy. "Tonight, I'm doing it by the paper," I said, trying to stay calm. Drew didn't argue. He didn't laugh again. He just shrugged like he didn't care, but his gaze kept sliding back toward the sight glass, even when he wasn't looking straight at it, like a part of him couldn't stop tracking it. That was enough. I kept moving. Panel, gauge, drain, screen, log. I repeated the loop like I could wear down whatever this was by being consistent. Like consistency itself was protection. The system didn't strike me. It didn't throw me across the corridor. It didn't shut the lights off or scream in my ear. It did something worse, something quieter. It proved the rules matched real events, and it did it with the kind of precision that made it feel intentional. By the time I reached the next cluster, my chest pocket felt like a life jacket. I didn't like that. I didn't like needing it. But I kept my hand away from the wall screen, kept my eyes off the sight glass, kept my steps measured, and wrote every single thing down like my handwriting was the only evidence I'd ever have. Reconcile kept popping up on different wall screens as I moved through the loop, never loud enough to force action, just persistent enough to drag me back into fix mode. That was the bait. It wasn't trying to scare me. It was trying to make me do my job the way I'd always done it. Fix the system, make the numbers clean, close the loop, move on. And every time it flashed, my hand wanted to lift. I could feel the muscle memory in my fingers, touch the screen, pull the trend, confirm the sensor, reconcile the flow. A simple sequence of actions that would make me feel like I had control again. I kept my hands down and logged it each time, clean and exact, and kept walking. The paper in my chest pocket felt heavier with every entry, like the rules were gaining weight as the building kept matching them with reality. The steady pump tone pressed against my ears with that same metronome calm, but under it I kept catching tiny dips, tiny deepening notes, like something was shifting in the system's throat and then smoothing back out. It never lasted long enough to diagnose, it just lasted long enough to be noticed. Drew started showing up more often, like he was bored and decided my loop was entertainment. He caught up with me near a wall screen right after it flashed reconcile again. I'd already written the value and the time when he leaned in, squinted at the display, and snorted. Just reconcile it. It's a typo, Drew insisted. No, I log it, I said quietly. He shook his head like he couldn't believe I was choosing the hard path on purpose. He wasn't wrong. Logging was slow. Logging was messy. Logging meant I'd have to explain myself later. Fixing would be cleaner. Fixing would make the whole night feel normal again. But the yellow line hadn't felt normal. The air compression hadn't felt normal. The phone ring hadn't felt normal. Drew's eyes hitching hadn't felt normal. And I didn't trust clean down here anymore. "You're really going to let a piece of paper run your shift?" he snapped. I didn't answer him right away because my answer was obvious and I didn't want to hear it out loud. The truth was, yes, I was letting a piece of paper run my shift because everything else here was too steady, too precise, too patient. The paper was the only thing that had predicted what would happen before it happened. That made it the most reliable tool I had. I moved on without arguing, because arguing with Drew didn't fix anything. It just fed the part of me that wanted to feel tough. Tough didn't pay my bills. Tough didn't make a night shift safer. Routine did. If routine still mattered here, it was all I had. The blue phone rang once behind me. I stopped, counted a beat, then turned my head just enough to see the alcove. Receiver still seated. No lights, just that one ring hanging in the air like a finger snap. I walked back, held the reset button for exactly 3 seconds, released, and kept moving. I wrote it down. Then it rang again, farther down the corridor, around a corner I hadn't planned to take yet. It felt like breadcrumbs, not leading me somewhere useful, just tugging at my attention, trying to make me break the loop and chase it. I refused. I stayed en route. Every time it rang, I did the same thing. reset, log, move. The frequency was what got under my skin. It messed with my timing. It made me second guess where I was in the circuit. It made me check my route sheet too often. It made me stop thinking like a person and start thinking like a metronome. That was when I realized how the place worked. It wasn't about one big event. It was about interrupting me just enough to make me slip. The transition to wet grading was waiting for me like a test I'd been pretending I could avoid. The corridor narrowed there. On one side, pipe runs crowded the wall. On the other, a panel cabinet and conduit forced you to angle your body to pass. The floor changed from dry concrete to wet grading in a short span, and the water pooled there in a thin sheet, reflecting the lights. The drain was slow, maybe clogged with grit. It made the whole section look slick and innocent, like the kind of problem you'd fix on a day shift with a bucket and a shop vac. The grounding bar was mounted right beside it, bare metal, scuffed and smudged. The spot where hands had touched it was darker, polished by skin oils and repetition. It looked cold. It looked dirty. Touching it with a bare hand felt stupid and gross, the kind of thing you'd roll your eyes at if someone told you to do it for luck. And still, my arm remembered the way the air had felt at the yellow line. My stomach remembered the phone ring. My brain remembered that small, sharp moment of certainty when the needle finally dropped and the corridor felt normal again. I approached the grating and hesitated, just a fraction. It was late, I was tired, and I was sick of being toyed with. I told myself the grounding bar was for static, for safety, for real electrical reasons, but I also told myself I could step over quickly and be fine. I had gloves on. My boots were insulated. Plenty of guys stepped over wet grating all the time without making a ritual out of it. The phone rang once somewhere behind me, like a reminder. I didn't want to give it the satisfaction of slowing me down. I stepped onto the wet grating without touching the grounding bar first. For half a second, nothing happened. Then, a sharp tingle snapped up my arm, fast and clean, like a tiny bite through my glove and into my skin. Not enough to throw me, not enough to drop me, just enough to make my heart skip and my mouth go dry. My hand jerked, reflexive, and my shoulder tightened hard. The pump tone deepened immediately, like the system heard the mistake and leaned in. The air didn't compress the way it had at the yellow line, but the corridor felt smaller. The lights felt harsher. The grating under my boots felt like it was humming, vibrating through the water into the bones of my feet. I stepped back onto dry concrete and stood there, breathing through my nose, trying not to panic. Panic would make me move fast. Moving fast would make me miss details. Missing details was how you died in stupid ways, whether the danger was supernatural or just electrical. Drew laughed once, low, like he'd heard the noise of my boots shifting and decided it was funny. I didn't look at him. I didn't give him that. I reached out with my bare hand and touched the grounding bar for 1 second, exactly, the way the rule demanded. The metal was colder than I expected. It wasn't just cold, it was empty, like touching a railing outside in winter and feeling the chill climb your bones. I pulled my hand back, wiped it on my jeans, and hated myself for being relieved. I logged the tingle too. I didn't write shock, because shock implies a fault you can measure. I wrote felt tingle on wet grating, time, location. Then I wrote grounding bar contact after, 1 second. My handwriting was still neat. My hand was shaking anyway. A second wall screen flashed reconcile again as I turned the corner, like it was watching my log. The value underneath it was different than the last one. Still plausible, still irritating, still begging to be corrected. Drew was behind me now, close enough that I could hear his breathing. "You're being weird about this," he said, not as a locked line, so I didn't answer him. I kept walking. The radio on my belt crackled. "Caleb, status," Marla asked over the radio. Her voice was calm. It didn't sound like she was checking in because she was worried. It sounded like she was checking in because it was time to check in, the way you do in a place built on routine. I pressed the push to talk, kept my tone flat, kept it professional. "Repeated reconcile flags. I'm logging only," I told her. There was a pause. Not long. Just long enough for my brain to picture her on the surface, looking at a folder, looking at a clock, deciding what my night needed to be next. "Finish your loop," she said, her voice still even, and the message landed without extra words. No freelancing, no climbing out early, no breaking the circuit because you feel nervous. I reached the stairwell corridor a few minutes later and saw the indicator on the heavy door. The interlock light was on. Not a red alarm, not a screaming siren, just a steady status that told me the building wasn't ready for me to leave that path yet. It could have been normal procedure. It could have been a timed lock. It could have been a maintenance cycle. The why didn't matter. The result did. I was still below grade. The blue phone rang once farther down the hall and stopped. I stood there for a second, staring at my route sheet and then at the corridor ahead, and I felt the shape of the night tighten around me. Not forever. Not trapped in some horror movie, just trapped in a loop with rules that matched real events in a system that kept trying to steer me into breaking them. I didn't have to believe in ghosts to understand the practical problem. Something down here responded to my choices. It wanted me to do what I always did: fix, correct, adjust. It wanted me to stop logging and start touching. It wanted me to chase sounds and rings and flashing banners until my routine fell apart. So I made a decision that wasn't brave. It was just workable. I went back to my route: panel, gauge, drain, screen, log. Reset, log, move. Touch the grounding bar when the floor turned wet. Step behind the yellow line when a needle stuck. Keep my eyes where they were supposed to be. Keep my hands off the screen. If I did each step clean, maybe the system would have nothing to grab. And if I didn't, I'd be the one giving it permission. The pump tone stopped being a sound I could ignore and turned into something I could feel. It wasn't louder. It was closer, like it had moved from the pipes into the air, from the air into my ribs. The vibration changed in small pulses, not random, not like load fluctuation. It came in patterns that made my brain want to turn it into language. Not words, not a voice, just the shape of speech, the way a mouth moves before you understand what it's saying. I kept walking my loop anyway, because if I stopped to listen too hard, I'd start chasing meaning, and chasing meaning was the whole trap. At the next gauge cluster, the needle rose again. It eased up to 66 and pinned itself dead center like it had earlier. Only this time it didn't feel like a single event. It felt like a checkpoint being activated. I checked my watch, counted, and at 6 it was still frozen. I stepped behind the yellow line, eyes down, shoulders tight, and waited for the corridor to let go. But it didn't. The air stayed dense. The pump vibration held that pulsing pattern as if it was keeping time for me on purpose. I kept my eyes on the grating and counted again. The needle finally dropped, and the pressure in the space eased just enough for me to breathe like a person again. I wrote it down with shaking fingers. Time, location, needle pinned, followed rule. Then, as I moved on to keep my road clean, I heard a second ping, farther away, not the traveling metal ping from earlier, but the quick, sharp sound of a needle tapping its stop. The kind of tiny sound you only notice when you're already keyed up. I rounded the corner to the next cluster and saw it. Another gauge, in a different corridor, different cabinet, different run, pinned on 66, perfectly still, like a mirror. For a second, my brain tried to do the math. Two gauges in two places shouldn't behave the same way at the same time, not unless the whole system had shifted in unison, and if the whole system had shifted in unison, there would be alarms, there would be lights, there would be something on SCADA screaming for attention. The wall screen nearby stayed calm. No banner, no flashing fault, just neat lines and normal numbers that made my skin crawl, because it meant the system was lying, or the system was filtering, or the system was only showing what it wanted shown. I stepped behind the yellow line again, without waiting for my watch to tell me to. My timing was shredding. My loop was breaking into fragments. Every time I had to retreat and wait, the route stopped being a circle and turned into a series of interruptions. That was the point. Routine depends on flow. Interrupt flow enough times and you start making choices instead of following steps. The blue emergency phone rang once somewhere ahead of me, crisp and sharp, then stopped. Not behind me this time. Ahead, like a finger pointing down the corridor. I didn't go to it. I didn't speed up. I wrote the time in my log anyway, because I couldn't help myself. Logging had become the only thing that felt like mine. Drew's footsteps came fast from behind. The first time all night he sounded like he was hurrying. His flashlight beam jittered on the wall, then cut across the floor. He caught up at the discharge run where the sight glass was mounted, breathing harder than he should have been for a casual walk. The pump tone dipped, then deepened, and the sight glass flickered. Not a reflection this time. Movement on the far side of the liquid, like a shadow sliding through water that should have been clear. It wasn't bubbles. It wasn't foam. It was something that made my eyes want to lock onto it and my stomach twist. Drew stepped toward it like he couldn't help himself. "Look at the glass. You need to see it," Drew pleaded. "No," I said, my voice coming out tight. "Then we're guessing," he muttered. He sounded angry, but it wasn't anger at me. It was anger at not being able to solve it the way he'd solved everything else in his life. Look at the problem. Name it. Fix it. Move on. That instinct was in my hands too, hovering in my fingers, begging to touch the wall screen, begging to pull data, begging to reconcile the flow. I could feel how easy it would be to give in. One glance, one adjustment, one moment of control. The blue phone rang once again, farther down the corridor, like it was applauding the argument. I didn't move toward it. I didn't look into the glass. I shifted my focus down to the floor drains beneath the run, because drains were physical, real, and boring in the only way that mattered. I crouched, shined my light, and saw the water there wasn't moving the way it had been. The flow had slowed, and the surface trembled, not from vibration, but from pressure building. It was subtle, but it was there. The system was loading up. That was actionable. That was something you could do without feeding the trap. I stood, stepped to the wet grating section, and touched the grounding bar on purpose. Bare hand. 1 second. Cold metal biting into my skin. I pulled back, wiped my palm on my jeans, and moved across the grating in measured steps, staying in my loop, not letting the flicker in the sight glass pull my head up. The pump vibration shifted again, and for a moment the pattern felt like it was leaning into me, like mechanical speech pressing closer to my bones. I reached the panel cabinet. The indicator lights were still green, still steady. That felt wrong in the deepest way. I knew something was building, and the system was acting like nothing was wrong. I could hear it in the tone, see it in the drain, feel it in the grating under my boots. I didn't have time to argue with Drew. I didn't have time to wait for SCADA to admit it. I needed a clean action that didn't require me to look into the glass. I grabbed the radio and made my voice stay level, like I was reading a step off a procedure sheet. "Marla, I'm shutting the pump down by panel. I'm not confirming by sight glass," I said into the radio. There was a pause, And in that pause, the whole corridor seemed to hold its breath. Even Drew went still. Even the flicker behind the sight glass seemed to hesitate, as if it was waiting to see whether I'd back off. "Copy, do it clean, then come up," she said quietly. That calm answer landed in my chest like a weight. No questions, no disbelief. "No, what do you mean you won't confirm?" Just copy, as if this was a known problem with a known response. I opened the cabinet and went through the shutdown sequence step by step, the way you do when you're trying to keep a machine from hurting someone. One control, then the next, then the next. No slamming switches, no panicked movements. I kept my eyes on the indicator lights and my hand steady because if the system was measuring anything, I didn't want it measuring fear. The moment the pump began to spool down, the water hammer hit. It was a slam that traveled through the pipes like a punch. Metal rang sharp and bright. The floor trembled so hard my knees buckled, and I had to grab the cabinet edge to keep from going down. The sound wasn't a single bang. It was a sequence, 2 fast hits, and then a heavier one, like something was throwing itself against the inside of the system. The corridor lights flickered once, just a twitch, then steadied. My body screamed at me to turn, to look, to find the source. I refused. I kept my eyes on the grating in the cabinet, kept my shoulders braced, kept my feet planted behind where the yellow line cut across the floor nearby. I didn't give the sound my face, but Drew did. He made a noise, half gasp, half curse, and he stepped wrong onto the wet grating without thinking, head turning toward the sight glass like it was the only answer left. His flashlight beam jumped, then froze on the pipe run. For a second, he stopped moving entirely. Not slipping, not falling. Just stalled, like his brain had been unplugged mid-thought. His mouth was slightly open. His eyes were fixed on something I refused to look at. His whole body went slack in a way that scared me more than the water hammer. I didn't shake him. I didn't scream his name. I didn't do anything dramatic. I grabbed his sleeve, pulled him back onto dry concrete, and put his hand on the grounding bar like it was a reset button for a human being. 1 second. Cold metal. Contact. Then I shoved the clipboard into his chest and forced the routine back into his hands. His blink came late, like the world had to buffer. He swallowed and looked down at the clipboard without understanding why it was there. I kept my voice low and flat in my head, not giving the place emotion to chew on. Move, breathe, don't look, don't touch the glass, keep your steps, keep your log. I guided him toward the corridor away from the discharge run, toward the stairwell route, because the loop was finished now. The pump was down. The cabinet lights showed safe. The system was quieting, even if the vibration still pressed faint patterns into the air. As we walked, the blue phone rang once behind us and stopped, like a final tap on the shoulder. I didn't go back. I didn't reset it. I didn't break the line. I kept moving. Marla's calm copy replayed in my head, and the truth settled into place without needing a big revelation. The place wasn't angry. It wasn't lashing out like a beast. It was calibrating. It kept presenting the same choices in different forms, not to punish mistakes, but to see what I'd do under pressure. Would I follow instinct, look, touch, fix, chase? Or would I let routine override instinct, step by step, even when it felt wrong? That was what it was doing to me, training my reflexes until they weren't mine anymore. By the time we got back to the surface, the sky had gone from black to that washed-out gray that shows up before sunrise, like someone turned the brightness up without adding color. Cold air hit my face the second the heavy door shut behind us. It smelled like dust and faint sagebrush, clean in a way that made my stomach turn. Down below, everything had weight, oil, metal, vibration. Up here, the world looked normal, and that normalcy felt wrong, like a lie told with a straight face. Marla was waiting in the surface room. The fluorescent lights buzzed the same way they had earlier, steady and uncaring. The SCADA display looked perfectly calm, neat lines and stable blocks like nothing had happened at all. Drew stood beside me for a moment, then drifted away toward a side hallway without a word, like he'd been pulled by a string I couldn't see. I started to follow him, then stopped. The building had already decided how that part would go. Marla didn't ask if I was okay. She didn't ask what I'd seen. She didn't ask why my hands were shaking when I set the clipboard down. "You did fine," Marla said evenly. It made heat flash behind my eyes. Not relief, not gratitude, anger. Because fine was what you said when you wanted a problem to stay small. Fine was what you wrote on reports when you didn't want attention. Fine was the word that erased the part of the night that couldn't be captured in numbers. I flipped through my log and pointed at the entries, keeping my finger steady. Times, locations, needle-pinned, reconcile flashes, blue phone rings, the tingle on wet grating, the shutdown sequence. I wanted her to look at the ink and admit that the system had been doing something. She just nodded at the right spots like she'd expected to see them, like my notes were confirmation, not a surprise. I swallowed hard and forced myself to speak without shaking it loose into something messy. "I'm not coming back down there," I told her. Marla's expression didn't change. She didn't argue with my fear. She didn't validate it either. She reached for a form on the counter and slid it toward me, like a door closing softly. "Turn in your badge at the front," she said, then stopped herself before adding anything else. The message was clear without extra words. Procedure, process, paperwork later. I handed the temporary badge back to security, signed out, and walked to my car under a sky that looked too ordinary to hold what had happened. The sight lights behind the fence kept burning that industrial yellow, steady and patient, like they'd still be there after I was gone. At home, I couldn't sleep. Every time my apartment got quiet, my brain filled it with that pump tone, steady and too consistent. When my water heater kicked on, the low hum in the wall made my shoulders jump. I stood in my kitchen staring at the little round gauge on the heater like it had insulted me. The needle climbed, slowed, and settled. Then it sat on 66, not forever, just long enough for my body to make the decision before I did. My feet stepped back. My eyes dropped to the floor. My breath got shallow like the air had turned dense again. I realized I was standing behind an invisible yellow line, waiting for permission to move.